And Harry Wilson joins us in studio tonight. Harry, thanks so much for making time for us.
Thanks for having me, Caitlin.
Now, it has been a little bit more of a relaxing week for you than it has been for some of the candidates who had a primary to deal with.
It's certainly better to be watching rather than waiting.
Yeah, exactly. And what have you been doing in the past week or two? Where has your campaign really kicked up? What's news with you guys?
Sure. Well, we continue to travel the state and get our message out and tell people, one, about how bad the fiscal status of our state is, and secondly, my vision for trying to transform the Comptroller's office to really be a major force in changing that.
And you said it's better to be watching than waiting, so you were watching the primary elections. What did you think as everything shook out?
Well, it was, look, a lot of things came through loud and clear in the night. One, I think the level of both turnout as well as the results show that people are very angry with the direction of Albany. I think they're desperate for change. They're desperate for fresh leadership, particularly people with business backgrounds who can really drive major change in Albany. I think that plays very well with my background and my experience is what I'm trying to do. But it should be a real wake-up call to how bad, how much people realize how bad things are in Albany.
And you say people with business backgrounds. That certainly rings true for Carl Paladino, who won the Republican nomination for governor. You've yet to really take a position on Mr. Paladino. What did you think of his win, and will you be endorsing him?
Sure. Well, he had a huge victory, given the magnitude of the win. And again, I think it kind of speaks to the mood of the electorate. But in my case, I've been saying pretty consistently that I want to try to stay out of other races, and have said that I won't be endorsing in the governor's race, or any other race for that matter. And the reason for that is because I think the Comptroller, which has been a politicized position for a long time, I think really needs to be a professional position. If you look at the responsibilities, it's someone who manages the state pension fund and uses the audit power to go after fiscal mismanagement. Those are really professional roles, and that's what my background is. And I think that you cheapen the role by making it political, and I think hurting one's credibility in dealing with the serious financial matters that are problems in the state.
But you got to face it, you are a politician, you're a Republican, and you're now running with this man. Do you think that your values match up? Are you proud to be on the ticket with him?
Well, I think my whole focus is really on my race, and it's been that since the beginning. I think, the problem with I think that a lot of politicians fall into is they get into areas that really have nothing to do with their role. So my role is really fundamentally explaining the problems of the state enough and what I can do to change that so I can win, and then changing it. And all the things that are beyond the powers of the Comptroller's office really are irrelevant to the Comptroller's role. And I think that if our state was well managed and fiscally healthy, then maybe people could have the luxury of getting into other issues. But I have to be focused like a laser on the problems of the state and trying to fix them.
If you are elected, though, you're going to have to work with the legislature and whoever the governor is that's elected.
Yes.
Given the choice, would you rather work with Andrew Cuomo or Carl Paladino?
I'm definitely not answering that question.
All right, we're backing up from that one slowly.
But to your point, though, I won't have to work with whoever the governor is. And I think, one, the important thing is, I think, to be independent, so you can kind of call the facts as you see them, but also be able to work constructively with people across the aisle. And I've worked with, obviously, with Republicans and with Democrats over the course of my career. So I'd be happy to work with, I have one vote in the system, and whoever ends up winning the process will be the person I'll be working with.
But how would that one vote change as opposed to Tom DiNapoli's vote that he has right now? What would you be doing differently if elected comptroller?
Sure. And by the way, when I said one vote, I mean one vote on election day. But
right.
In terms of my role as comptroller, it'd be a very different position from the way Mr. DiNapoli envisions it. First of all, I think that the biggest problem we have is excess spending in Albany, and it's bankrupting our state. I created the highest state and local tax burden in the country that New Yorkers simply can't afford. And I think what the comptroller should be doing, instead of just issuing reports and saying that we have a problem, which everybody realizes, the comptroller should be identifying specific opportunities for cost savings and cost reductions. The comptroller has the power to audit every dollar of state spending. So if we combine that power with the skill set that I had in restructuring broken companies in the private sector, I think that I can come up with a specific set of cuts, work with the legislature and the governor to implement those, and actually be a constructive force for change, not just a commentator on the problems.
But within the confines of that position, as the comptroller, you are really bound to certain rules and regulations. How would you really implement your pretty ambitious agenda within those confines?
Well, the Attorney General's position used to be much more narrow than it has been in recent years as well, and it had some people who've been in that position who took the full powers of the office and used it more aggressively. I intend to do the same thing with the Comptroller's office and use it to go after spending much more aggressively. So what I just described to you is within the powers of the existing office, the Comptroller has the power to audit every dollar of state spending. It just hasn't been used in the way that I describe it. But there's nothing restricting the Comptroller from doing that, and being able to identify those pockets of savings requires someone with the right background and skill set and independence to really identify them. That's just one area. The second area is the pension fund. We have a massive problem in our state pension fund. It's dramatically underperformed, both its peers as well as its benchmark in recent years. If you applied private sector accounting to the pension fund, it would reveal a hole in the tens of billions of dollars. And that problem is one that we have to deal with because it's going to drive property taxes much higher in coming years. I think the right way to deal with it is to acknowledge the problem, identify the real size of the problem. We have to protect benefits of existing employees protected by the state constitution. New Yorkers can't afford higher taxes to deal with the problem, so you got to create a long-term fix. And in my private sector background, particularly in my work leading the restructuring in General Motors, that's exactly what I used to do, is create long-term fixes for problems. And so that would be another example of an area that I would do very differently than Mr. Napoli.
You say pension fund, and a lot of New Yorkers automatically get their backs up. They get very nervous about it. What would you do to kind of assuage those fears and say, hey, it's going to be all right moving forward. We are going to fix this?
Right. So I think there are kind of three buckets of things to be worried about. The first is existing employees. The second is new employees. And the third is taxpayers who bear the cost of any shortfalls. On existing employees, they have nothing to worry about because those benefits are constitutionally protected. And I'm sure Mr. Napoli sees it the same way, so I don't think there's a material difference in that regard. On taxpayers, the problem is because of the underperformance in recent years, those taxes are going up. Now, we've been saying this for months. Mr. Napoli has argued that it's not the case, and just 2 weeks ago came out and actually announced a huge increase in the contribution rates from state and local governments, triggering a tax increase of somewhere between $200 and $300 a household just next year. And the problems get much worse after that. So our approach on that is we've got to hold the line on taxes and create a long-term solution, not just try to balance the problem on the backs of taxpayers in the short term. And the third piece where we are very different is I'm saying because of this problem that's been created, we need to fix it. And the only real lever left is creating a new benefit package for new employees. It's got to be a fair package that's enough to attract new employees to come to work for government. We want to have talented people in government, but it also has to be competitive with the private sector. And that new tier, likely a tier 6, is one that will help address our problems, but in a fair way that both is fair to taxpayers and fair to employees.
And you mentioned the things that Mr. DiNapoli is doing, in your opinion, poorly. He actually was on the offensive against you a couple weeks ago, saying that you violated campaign regulations by releasing internal polling numbers. What's your response to that? Well,
we didn't release internal polling numbers. We shared some data with some of our closest supporters from an internal poll that we did. And in that, when that was leaked through one of the people who received it to one of the media outlets, I think it may have been
it was
you guys. So great job on the scoop. But I don't know who leaked it. However, it was leaked. That was reported, and then they later said, well, that we have to disclose the memo, which we did. We filed the memo with the election agency as soon as they highlighted it to us.
Well, you've made a big deal out of not being a politician, being an Albany outsider. Trying to play the political game is a little bit different now, isn't it?
It is. And, look, there are a lot of reasons why good people to go into public life. And, there's so many people across the state that complain about the quality of our leadership in public life and say that it's so much less talented and less good and is not particularly adept to dealing with our problems. And I think that's true. And the reason is because a lot of the garbage, if you will, that goes on in public life. But what I've tried to do is basically kind of deal with the garbage as little as possible, focus solely on what I have control over, which is kind of the message and trying to fix the problem, and really take that business skill set to Albany. Now, there's no question there are all kinds of distractions and things like that, but I've been pretty good about keeping disciplined and focused, and that's what I want to try to keep doing, because I think that's the only way we get through this mess.
Well, you mentioned a lot of what's wrong with Albany. If you are elected comptroller, you do have the capacity to introduce legislation, to really change government. What are some things that you would focus on that you think need to change?
Sure. Well, I think, fundamentally it comes down to, kind of our spending priorities. And one thing I would do in my first year is effectively go through, in a forensic audit, every dollar of state spending. It's $136 billion. Identify, basically every pocket, not just of fraud and waste, which everybody's opposed to and everybody talks about, but the bigger dollars associated with just programs that don't work very well and financial mismanagement. And that is it's a huge task. It's what I did at every company I went through in restructuring, including General Motors. And I think we'll see, massive amounts of misspent resources. And that will, I think, allow us to really kind of drive major change in the budget, allow us to eliminate next year's deficit without tax increases, which I think is critical, but then hopefully allow us to actually rein back the size of government and cut taxes.
Lastly, looking at your next month and a half campaigning for this position, what's it going to look like? What are you going to be focused the most on?
Sure. So we only have 46 days left, and so it's rapidly approaching. But I think, kind of my message of driving spending reform, pension reform, and then the third part, which we didn't talk about tonight, but is really working to roll back a lot of the unfunded mandates that drive up property taxes. Most people are aware that a big reason why property taxes are as high as they are is because the state passes through unfunded mandates to local governments. Local governments have no control over them, and yet they're forced to fund these costs. The comptroller should and can identify the cost of these mandates and work for mandate relief, and identify specific proposals and ways to actually create good public policy but do it in a cheaper way. And I think if I can communicate those three pillars of spending reform, pension reform, and mandate relief, which I think are ultimately the three things that are most in the interest of the taxpayers of the state and we desperately need relief, I'll have done my job and hopefully gotten the right message out.
Certainly an ambitious agenda, to say the least.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us, Harry Wilson.
Thanks for having me, Caitlin.